I think that there is an inverse relationship. It used to be West disengaged, West engaged in Balkans more, and Russia disengaged because of its weakness. Now we have the other way around in our region, which is West is mostly disengaged and Russia is mostly engaged. So that creates the pattern where I can talk about kind of the tendency, how I see things going forward. If things not change, of course, I'm not saying that that's definitely the scenario which is going to be followed up, but I do see that inversive trend. Well, what should we do? I definitely think that there are limits that the small countries can do, because we just cannot create strides, and that's the big problem, because there is a caveat and there is a conditionality attached to what small countries can do. So the only thing I foresee as being that the small countries, the countries of the region, try to shore up support for the vision that they have. And I hope that that's the vision of preserving sovereignty and not letting the other players decide our fate. And of course, the work that we have to be conducting is of course, very much political and diplomatic. But apart from this, of course, I do see the very clear trends that are important to uphold. Like, I'll be talking about Georgia, what is important for us. In Georgia, every time we do polling of the population about our Euro-Atlantic aspirations, we have very high numbers. We have approximately 80, low 80s, high 70s supporting this trend. So for Georgia, I would see that being something that we have to be working on, forming an opinion which will be helping to uphold these things. I think it's extremely important. Why? Because in recent weeks and recent months, I've seen and we have been observing the activation of Russian activities providing the alternative narrative. Of course, this is not really a mainstream yet, but what I see is that there is the activation of the turf in Georgia. So there are a few things that I'll be putting into perspective, the long term and the short term. In the long term, I think there is an understanding, and I think that's an unfortunate understanding, that the West might be on a decline. And the narrative about that it has been very much cultivated in our region. So if we get that, I mean, if we fix that as a kind of one of the scenarios, then of course the void which will be created is definitely going to be filled by some powers, the regional powers. We definitely don't see Turkey right now putting up the muscle to argue for alternative scenario. If that void is created, and if we see there is much alienation on behalf of Turkey vis-a-vis EU vis-a-vis Turkey, I see that cleavage actually increasing. And if that happens, our countries will find itself in an isolated isle. And once again, when we talk about the long-term trends, we have to take all of that into account. And unfortunate reality is that not many people beyond the region or this narrow circle of pundits understand the real repercussions.
Thank you. Vytis?
Well, first of all, of course, the main thing is sticking to the principles, right? Non-recognition, that's important. Then the second point would be the damage control. So we need to think about our partners in the Eastern Partnership region and work with the authorities that these provocations, incidents do not overspill the frozen conflicts, these regions. The third thing is to step in when it comes to like we were talking, that it's only the reaction. We need to be more assertive here. Like, West needs to challenge and play hard here, especially when we talk about the principle of self-determination. I haven't heard really none of the politicians raising the issue of the Tatarstan. 22 years ago, there was a referendum which was like in Tatarstan, and Kremlin ignored that. Nobody's talking about that, and there are many regions which potentially could be a threat to Russia itself if it declares that self-determination is a principle. But we need to be really play hard here. So the other thing is understanding that for Russian Federation, sustaining these regions is quite an expensive business. Of course, in case of Ossetia, I would argue that the money is disappearing there. Like when we look per capita, so we understand that it's almost the laundering mechanism for the money, right? But having Crimea, it also affects the Russian budget, and I don't think that Kremlin has a lot of luxury here. With the markets reacting faster, I think that in some cases these conflicts are even instigated just to hide some of the problems, especially addressing the local populations here. But the most importantly, I think that, as I have said earlier, working with the civil societies, like even in the conflict regions, we need to communicate with them. Like otherwise, they are brainwashed. They actually, some of them even don't understand the consequences, what it is to be in the Russian Federation as such, right? And I think that it's also important to talk to the Russian population, because like the support which is growing to Putin, it's incredible, but we understand why it's happening so. And there's a problem that I guess we are not talking, we don't have good communication channels with the Russian civil society. We stick to the very same opposition as if they are the players, and they are not. And we know why, again. So we need to have channels of communication. And therefore, like, I was coming back to the point which was raised, as if I'm the supporter of the passportization, God forbid. I mean, really, I think that it's a huge problem. But I'm challenging the EU policy here regarding the recognition of the Russian passports. If I want to bring the Abkhazians to Europe, it's difficult. Though I know that the same Abkhazians are going on the touristic basis to Czech Republic, to Spain, and then I would question the efficiency of such non-recognition policy. But passportization is a huge threat, especially when we had these conversations regarding the visa-free regime with Russia. That's insane. That would kill all the Eastern Partnership Initiative if it is not dead yet, right? So because that would be a signal that all these people with the Russian passports, the easiest way for them to Brussels would be going through Moscow, and that would be so another thing which we might think is about easing the visa process for Ukrainians, Armenians, Azeris, Moldovans, etc., etc. The faster we go with that, the better chances we have with the people-to-people contacts. And then in the long term, it wouldn't produce immediate results, but that's the way we should be patient here, and we should work on this.
Thank you. Vladimir.
To Irakli's question about where the new Iron Curtain would run. Recently, the Russian officials are taking the position publicly that there will be a new dividing line that would run not along the country's borders, but inside those countries that are oriented themselves to the West. In other words, enforced partition as punishment for Western-oriented countries, which we have seen de facto already in Moldova, officially declared in Georgia, de facto in Azerbaijan, and officially declared in the case of Crimea.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to come in on Irakli's point. He was giving an overview of these preparatory kind of actions that Putin did during his first half of the second presidency, as which we can now see as being not just sort of random actions, but preparation for kind of revanchist expansion. You are talking about the sort of passport and citizenship policy and military upgrade and so on and so forth. And I would like to put in as a sort of, possibly as a suggestion or a question that the fairly sort of extensive buying into European sort of industries, which was happening in the first decade of the millennium, as well as promotion of sort of shared projects with major European companies, was a way of ensuring kind of economic hinterground for such actions, because you referred yourself to this kind of resilience of the stock markets towards towards Russian aggression. As you say, there would be a sort of immediate drop, but in the absence of sustained sanctions or sort of more clearly pronounced attitudes of the governments of the West, the stock markets would sort of spring back fairly rapidly. And one of the reasons is that, the interconnectedness into which Russia was heavily investing in sort of making, in a sense, European economy too interdependent with the sort of fortunes of Russian economy, and hence making any prolonged kind of withdrawal of the markets fairly impossible. What's your take on that?
I think that the argument is very much the argument which stands. Actually, Russian policy of interconnecting the world based on the economic and financial interests has been very much used as a tool, like energy. Because there is a very interesting book which is the Comrade J. I don't know if many have read this book, but that's actually the book where the former intelligence officer of Russia who defects to the United States explains the very idea of how Russia's thinking about creating this interconnectedness is actually becoming the part of the Russian policy. Basically, what he talks about is that the new opportunities that Russia gives to the Western companies or Western businesses creates a soil for actually projecting the interests that Russia would otherwise will be not able to project. So definitely, I mean, as I see the evolution of the arguments in support of not punishing Russia, I do see that there is a clear lobby in Brussels, for example, which is the lobby right now very much orchestrated by the EU, the head of the EU Chamber of Commerce in Russia. I mean, he basically went there in Brussels and was arguing about less of sanctions for the actions that actually Russia took against Ukraine. I mean, so you see a clear sign. But of course, that's not the only repercussion and the only ripple. We also have to talk about the so-called multipolar world that Putin has been advocating as its foreign policy doctrine for one of the parts of his foreign policy doctrine, which very much actually helps to achieve this. And if we look at the way it has played out, let it be the energy-wise, and Vlad can talk more in depth about it, but that's exactly what has been happening, because the energy interest that Russia has been lobbying in most of the European countries has been exactly the divide part of this monolith that one can understand as being counter to Russia's interests. So I do see that Russia's interests are projected by the economic and financial means, and it has been part of their foreign policy projection weaponry or arsenal.
But while energy policy is in a sense a very sort of direct way of projecting power, it's a sort of pushing energy squeeze, energy sort of blackmail, but I see a different strategy of kind of purchasing sufficient number of strategic industries in the West, which would make any sanctions or by the markets themselves sort of fairly unfeasible in the long run. Please, James.
Go ahead.
Right, so thank you. Interesting discussion so far. But if I were to boil it down and to summarize it, then the discussion seems to me to be basically divided into two parts. Russia, a spoiler, inferiority complex, trying to rebuild an empire, succeeding in parts, but overall doomed to failure on the one side. And the West, on the other side, weak, insufficiently engaged, poor financially, but generally spineless. And believe me, I do not at all disagree with that. That's my own summary, obviously. But that seems to be that seems to be roughly to what I would boil down the discussion to so far. But there is another argument. It's not my argument, but it's a powerful argument, not an intellectually powerful argument, but an expediently or operationally powerful argument, which is that Russia. It'll be outlined tomorrow, actually. I shouldn't really say who, because it's a bit unfair, but I know that one of the speakers tomorrow takes this view. It's not my view, but this argument is that Russia is the dominant player in the region, like it or not. The West can do nothing about it, like it or not. The Eastern Partnership was a failure. It was meant to be a failure. It was a token. It was a token piece of. It was a token offering to these six countries, and that we ultimately need to come to an accommodation with Russia, which is not unlike, say, the Finland accommodation and neutrality, whereby these countries will be broadly independent, but certainly not as far as their geopolitical orientation is concerned, because we cannot do anything about it. And because of that, we have to get real and be realistic, and ultimately they'll have to be divided. I know that is absolutely blasphemy in this room, and it is to me as well, by the way, because believe me, I nothing outrages me more. But it is certainly a very powerful argument to those people who just want this problem to go away. And believe me, there are so many people in the West who want this problem to go away. And they would love to come to a nice deal with Russia and to get on to and to get back to doing business with usual, as the head of BP said in his annual general meeting in London just yesterday. So I suppose my point is I think we're all going to agree, or most of us are going to agree here, except perhaps this one speaker tomorrow, which I'll be very interested to hear him. And I want to know how do we. And I have my own ideas on this, but I won't go into them now. But how are we going to get out of this paradigm whereby we combat the weakness of the West, the greater determination of Russia, when we're stuck in this rut, if you like, and we're unable and unwilling to really do anything about it, because doing something about it would mean a radical change to geopolitics and politicians. Unlike markets, and I do agree with you very directly, because I think that markets are a little bit stronger, and markets could well be an answer here. But politicians just aren't willing to do this. And that doesn't mean to say Russia's going to win, because, as I say, Russia is unable to win because it's turning back. It's the wrong side of history, that kind of stuff. It's pushing against the tide in a King Canute-like fashion. But it does mean that we're not going to win either. It's certainly not in the near term. Somebody said earlier that these states are unsustainable. The separatist states are unsustainable. That may be true, but it takes an awfully long time for them not to be sustainable. Because Russia doesn't want them to flourish. It's not like Russia wants South Ossetia or Crimea to be a perfect example of statehood. It just wants it to rumble on poorly, pathetically, really, and they can do that for a long, long time. So it's all very well to say, oh yeah, well, Crimea can't survive on its own, South Ossetia can't survive on its own. Well, it can, just really badly. So ultimately, I'm just wondering how we get out of this stagnation, that's the word, rut, because I'm in agreement with everybody here, I think, that Russia is more determined, even if the West is stronger. But the West isn't willing to use that strength. And if we're not willing to use that strength, and it seems that we're not, where do we go?
Thank you. Yes.
Geared at Irakli. I was wondering whether the Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan trilateral integration is a degree of an antidote to some of the problems for the region, in that TANAP, the railway that I still don't understand why it's not finished, but and other, this effort to create a political component to this integration as well. Do you see this as alleviating some of these potential threats, creating a Western stakeholder, increasing the Western stakeholder element in the region? Is this something that should be focused on more intently, developed, given more vision, given more importance? And if so, is it also perceived from Moscow as a threat, or is this something irrelevant from Moscow's perspective because it's not going to lead anywhere anyway? In addition, how can one, do you think one can or should increase the political strategic vision as opposed to keeping it as an infrastructure, economic type process, which I see it as for the most part now? I don't see the three countries really aligning strategically, except for to the extent that those pipelines and railways and everything have a strategic value.
Thank you. So now we have really time for closing remarks by the concluding remarks by the panelists, bearing in mind that coffee is waiting outside, right?
Very briefly, of course, I don't have like the silver. There's no silver bullet saying like how we could compete with Russia. But my argument would be, it's not actually about the competition. That's what Kremlin is pushing us for, to be in this zero-sum game. And when we are in the zero-sum game, and we are mostly talking about geopolitics, then we are doomed to lose. Europe is doomed to lose, I think, because we don't have enough resources, we don't have the political will. But I think that Europe was always better playing in this soft power, maybe, approach, if you will, and in this attitude, the win-win perspective, and of course and Kremlin doesn't know how to play the game win-win. But I think the civil society could play that game, and therefore, we need to outreach the population, the people there. And I would give you just one tiny example here. In my hometown here, like in Vilnius, in Lithuania, we are not even capable to outreach normally to the Russian and Polish-speaking population. We are losing them here in our home court to the Russian media. So, if we are losing here, I think that we are just not thinking about it enough. And I think that we should think how to outreach the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, in Armenia, because otherwise, of course, we are doomed to lose. So having this perspective of the win-win approach, economic approach, including and less geopolitics, more people to people.
Thank you, Irakli.
Just to start from the second question, absolutely. I mean, of course, there is potential, and I guess. Georgia, Turkey, Azerbaijan. I mean, we all of us have very much the interests which do converge in many ways. Because I mean, no matter what people will say, of course, that's definitely an alternative to what Russia can offer to the region, and I don't see it otherwise. Well, about the prospects, can it be more political? There were actually attempts throughout this time to have more political triangle or the. There were attempts. There were a few actually declarations of the three foreign ministers, which have been the case for almost 2 years now, almost. And there are attempts, but unfortunately, this desire is not matched by the resources, but also by the willingness. And I have to be talking, and I can analyze all three within that. I mean, let's look at Georgia right now. Georgian government is very much scared of Russia at the moment. I mean, I have to be very clear that they don't want to take up any initiative at the moment, which will in any way irritate Russia. We have been on this very passive turn for quite some time, talking about changing the form rather than the substance vis-a-vis Russia, for example. They think that, if we don't talk too much about the Russians, if we don't talk about their problems, the problems will go away or it's going to be postponed. So that's the mindset that Georgians have right now. I mean, the government, which is, let's not get into things that might damage the very fragile state of where Georgia is right now. So that's going to be continuing. Okay, if that's the case, of course, our friends in Baku also think, they have to balance their own cards. And I have to be very clear, I have to speak my mind, and that's very pragmatic, of course. And neither of us can define the agenda by ourselves. And that's very much the clear sense that all of us, I guess, have. And then comes the biggest player. Of course, it's Turkey. Well, is Turkey ready to really see itself being a power which is going to be defining its interests in a different way that it has for the past decades? Well, I'm not really sure that thinking has been part of the foreign policy establishment in Turkey. And we talked a lot about it, and I don't see that being the case for now. But there are too many things that can really be pushing Turkey not to take this role. Of course, this is very much the dependency on the many soft power elements of the cooperation that they have with Russians. I mean, that's very much has been the premise that has been very a huge argument, and I don't see any argument actually in the short term overturning that trend. The other thing is that Turkey doesn't really see itself putting a lot of muscles in the region up until now. They're more concerned about increasing the appeal rather than really showing any potentially Russia countering activities. They clearly don't want to be messing with Russia at the moment. That's the feeling that there is. So if we have these three elements, all these three countries, I don't really see in the short term a political element added to it, even though all of us are interested. That's what I'm saying. But I just see that the prerequisites for that have been absent. I personally think that there is no alternative to that. So in the long run, that can be one of the game changers. But but it's not only going to be about Turkey as well. It has to be some others as well. I mean, if we look at how the history has been evolving, if we look at all the energy projects, it has always been about a bigger player than all of us. So it was U.S. during those times, which just lobbied it big time. So what I'm saying is that there are regional powers, there are small countries in the region, and there are the powers who actually can define the geopolitical landscape. TANAP is important, of course, because it
Sure.
It defines it kind of enhances the whole thing. But when it comes to the bigger things, I think that there needs to be more effort put in it, and I don't see that effort actually being either willing to be taken by someone or actually the resources for that to be the case. What should happen in order to change the whole logic? I actually know who you are talking about the skeptic, and I've heard that argument for quite some time. There is certain logic in that argument, frankly. And I've talked a lot with people with that arguments. Well, then it's about soul searching inside Europe and the West. That's exactly the question I was putting forward. What the Western countries are about. And I cannot answer that question myself. Of course, that's the question which has to be answered by others as well. But of course, that's the realism argument. The Cold War realist argument. Which actually is very, which has been taking traction in the United States as well. In certain circles right now, and that's how they're seeing things. But one thing that can change that is actually the big crisis, which will affect them as well. So which will affect the West in a way which hasn't been affecting. So if that doesn't happen, of course, there isn't going to be the same clarity to the goal. And then I usually say that these big shocks create a better ground. And of course, we also have to talk about domestic politics in major countries. You know, I mean, definitely there is more populistic stand, you know, on many issues, and the populism has to be fed by certain resources, or let's say by the economics, or by the by being lavishly spending on some of the things. So if that's the argument, you know, if the populism, you know, and there is more populism and less value-based politics in Europe or elsewhere, well, that's going to be very difficult to change that trend, provided that there is no bigger crisis, the shock which actually affects lives, because people have to argue for being more interventionist. And I do see that being the big problem for lots of politicians in the environment where when the local people don't really understand why they have to invest resources in Georgia, in Ukraine. That argument has been missing. You know, no one is trying to explain that to people, their audiences.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's thank